Okay, welcome, folks. This is pregame, the usual pregame for Unfound on the Ground number 30. I am going to take care of some of the usual tech check and get some of these chat disclaimers up that I will read and so forth. Again, if you're watching this in the future, when this is eventually released, and if you're new to Unfound, the Unfound concept, or maybe not so new and never subscribed, well, subscribe to this channel. Again, the protocol we use is we make these things, and then Ed and I have a cycle in which they are released. Regardless of timing, like it. If you like it, hopefully you do. And again, when this is public, which will be in the future, when you're seeing it, please share this episode. So again, this is the Tech Check pregame. This does make it into the recording. So I get here, a little bit early just to make sure everything's working from a tech standpoint. And once in a great while, maybe once, maybe twice, we've had a tech issue or two, but we get through it. And tonight is our time to review episode. We've been through, up till this point, 29 episodes. 29 will be out soon. And this will be number 30. Hard to believe it. We'll talk more about that when we get started. Looks like my sound's working and so forth. So I try to get here early for that. Of course, as always, one of the first things that I mention is for when you're watching this, when it's out there, the unfoundpodcast.com, the unfoundpodcast.com, which is the home for all things Unfound, including Unfound on the Ground, which I'll remind folks tonight as something part of the mix. It's a great resource. Of course, with the podcast, which is really the main aspect of the Unfound program, when Ed has his weekly podcasts that are released, and then, of course, everything that goes with Unfound, the Facebook page, the think tank, various supplemental materials that Ed posts, some action on Twitter and elsewhere. But really, the unfoundpodcast.com is a good central hub of things. Of course, there's a lot that goes on the Facebook group, on impressively, for the Unfound Facebook group. There's also the Unfound Facebook page that does, as we know, if you know anything about Facebook, pages can be interactive, but there's an aspect of it that tends to be more one way, whereas groups, although it's primarily about not only pushing what Unfound's doing, but also follow-ups, discussions. Obviously, you see a lot of folks using it to raise awareness about other cases. Obviously, there are important rules that are followed. To run a good social media group, you need to have protocols and rules. It's not a free-for-all, nor should it be. It should not be the Wild West, so to speak, of talking about whatever, if it's going to be run properly, professionally, and with precision. And so we have about 2 minutes. So this is the pregame. Got some preliminaries like usual typed up. And this does end up being part of the recorded version that will be out in the future. Again, we'll soon be releasing number 29. And so we've made 29 episodes, with 28 have been released. And 29 soon. And we'll be going into that. So again, if you're here tonight, go ahead and like this. We don't share it yet until it's public, when it's released. But we are liking it. If you're liking your experience tonight, if you have any tech problems, let me know. You should be able to hear me. And we'll go from there. We have about a minute or just under a minute. And so we'll be going from there. And as always, folks can chime in on the chat, say hello. We have that live chat going, which does make it into the recording. And this is an important episode tonight. Making our 30th episode of Unfound on the Ground. So with that, we begin. It is now 6:15 p.m. Mountain Time, 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Eric Grabowski here. I am the ongoing host of Unfound on the Ground. I am my primary line of work is in academia. I'm a scholar and teacher of communication, primarily with a background in rhetorical studies. But on the side, I do cold case journalism and try to participate in whatever collaborations that time permits. As always, my views tonight don't necessarily reflect those of my employing institution. I do have our usual disclaimers typed up that we've been using pretty much from the start on Unfound. So there it is. This is time to review episode number 30 we're making. It will be recorded, video and audio, including the text chat. So the text chat shows up, which is helpful because of the comments and so forth. Chat participation is an option. For the journalistic, promotional, and or commercial purposes of Unfound, the audio and video recording, including the text chat of this digital meeting, will be distributed by Unfound. By participating in this digital meeting, you agree to give Unfound permission to use the rendering of your words for journalistic, promotional, and or commercial purposes with no compensation to you from Unfound, its assistants, its affiliates, its partners, etc. Okay. White noise number 3, white noise level. Congratulations on 30, Eric. How do you pick the topics for your show? Is there overlap with what you teach and or your private research? This is a great way to start. I didn't even anticipate this. So from the start, and you can see here, and this is a great lead-in. Okay, so let me use this as a lead-in. So of course I intended to share the playlist, which goes up to number 28, soon number 29, and eventually number 30. So from the start, you can see up to a certain point, and it would have been after number 16, which was about genealogy research. We had a theme. And so I had some ideas, and the Unfound team had the ideas. And of course, in those days, Natasha was involved, and certainly want to give her, as they say nowadays, props for being a really strong driver of some ideas and some resources, and still influential in that way today. And so we had some themes. Some of them I think do overlap, especially as we started to get into not only the research side, but how to navigate analysis and controversies. Now, I'm not a criminologist or a lawyer, nor do I, as the saying goes, play one on television. But the idea of argumentation is certainly in my wheelhouse. Now, the value of Unfound, and unfortunately too few other programs, is to be very substantive and cautious with analysis and argumentation, to go where the evidence leads, not always in an absolute sense, but in a qualified sense, right? What are the open questions? What might we know? What do we need to know more about? What can we establish with some level of certainty? So as someone who comes out of that tradition of studying rhetoric and argumentation, and probably in those earlier episodes, I made some specific reference to some resources along the way. The one, and I'm going to mention this as a highlight tonight, of course, is well before I ever got into cold cases, being an amateur genealogist, which doesn't so much go to my academic areas, is just my own general view, and of course that gets really relevant to understanding not just missing persons cases, but the range of cold cases, whether that pertains to the person who's missing or murdered, or the person, their family, or those surrounding them, or alleged perps, and so forth. So those are two things I'll mention. Okay, Kathy, I had no time to prepare doctor's appointments, etc. However, Kathy, this was on my list. I wanted to thank everyone from our think tank premium members, also besides Ed and the team, for helping to guide where we got to. But and there have been certain think tank people, premium members, who have certainly been with us regularly. But and we appreciate all their work, and even for people who maybe just attended one episode or gave feedback to Ed, certainly there were improvements we needed to make along the way. Parentheses, I needed to make along the way. But that said, Kathy, I was planning to give you sort of the official, ongoing, Unfound on the Ground number 30 Participation Consistency Award, because Kathy, for the most part, of those very few that you missed, you've been with us from day one and consistently contributing. There have been others who have been involved somewhat consistently, but Kathy, you are our leader in that way. So I want to give you a round of applause for that, and thank you for that, being a part of that. There you go, White Noise 3. Congratulations. So that said, with the playlist out there, let me give a little bit of narrative here, and I'm not going to spend all night talking about how we got to where we were, because part of the reason I proposed this idea to Ed. And by the way, let me finish my thought there. So at some point, and this was really an Ed idea, we decided to switch from themes to case study applications. So you can see from number 17 forward, we used specific cases to discuss these as case studies for research, analysis, and publicity ideas. And so, these are cases that I'm not necessarily an expert on. Now, there are some that I know a little bit more about than others, but I don't purport to be, for instance, a Hoffa expert. I know, like I think I even indicated in that episode, if I want to learn more about Hoffa or cite good discussions about Hoffa, I know who the experts are. I know where some of the primary source material are. I know who what I would say small number of credible secondary source people are, and so forth. So we use these. Now, I do hope through these also to continue to raise visibility about the importance of these cases, as well as some of the issues that go with it. So they become case studies. I think that was a really good idea that Ed had and we discussed, and I think it has helped. It's helped me too get familiar with some cases that I didn't know about at all, never heard of, or knew a little bit about, and then pursued along those ways. So obviously during COVID, there was a greater awareness of utilizing technology. Obviously, that was already kind of going, I think, with me and just some discussions with the team and trying to think about some alternative ideas. So it sort of made sense at the time. And so as a preliminary resource, I certainly did have the first on the ground, raising awareness of missing persons, mindsets and methods, which really does reflect the dispositions that we brought to the table because if we recall, and I occasionally still make reference to this, and maybe going forward, if there's some areas of that original fabric that I think needs some revisitation or revitalization. We put these ideas together and still do, with the idea that whether someone is interested in sort of getting interested in a case at a deeper level, whatever term you want to use, citizen journalism, citizen sleuthing, or even for those who are doing this stuff professionally. If someone was doing advocacy, PR, awareness, whatever term you want to use, community engagement, whether that case hit close to home for them or they just wanted to be a good citizen, I don't want to sound reductionistic, whether they wanted to be a good citizen and really raise awareness about missing persons in general or specific cases. We wanted the resources that this program, which is a sort of, as I call it sometimes, a spin-off of Unfound, right? So to really suit those areas in different ways. And even just the basic everydayness of, which I don't do enough of, for sure, which we talked about in those early episodes, is what are the resources out there to go to credible resources to share information about unsolved cases. Of course, we have Unfound, we have the FBI, we have Charlie Project. Use those sources to our advantage. Here we go. I don't know if you can answer. Do you help Ed on his cases by using genealogy resources? It would be helpful. Well, yes. Let me say this. I do not help Ed close in any way, shape, or form to those other team members. However, in the cases where I have helped Ed, genealogy most of the time has been somewhere in the mix. I don't want to say always at the same level, but it certainly plays a role. It's a go-to. Now, there may have been one or two cases where I've not had to really think about it as much. But there's been other cases, other discussions where it's at least been on my list. There's certainly been one case in particular that I've done a ton of the follow-up on, sort of springboarding from what Ed did in that episode, got interested in it. And genealogy's played a lot of that role. This is certainly something I probably should, first of all, as a team member, I should participate more in the cases, although we all have our own schedule. And that would always be an area that I could do more with. Not that Ed and other team members aren't thinking about that. I don't want to give that impression either. But it's an area that I've had an interest in for years, and it certainly helped me. Being a very knowledgeable amateur genealogist has helped me on that. Because sometimes, it's those databases and resources give you to know more about the person, the people around them, other family members, more historical context. Frankly, sometimes, I'll be honest, if you're looking to just find somebody to talk to who may know something about the case or know the missing person, yes, in those cases, I have used those genealogy databases because you're trying to figure out what name they might be going under now, or where they've lived 20 years ago, or where their relative may have lived, or some nuance about them. That's a great question. I should have told people, this is great, Natasha, come with questions tonight. So I'm glad you're doing that. So from those early episodes, right, those have been areas. And so, that is something I've maybe not as explicit about it, and you don't always have to be, but those are the areas, because we have people that listen to Unfound and who participate even in the extras, who do those sorts of things, that they may have their own blog, or they might do a lot of sharing, or they may be involved in community advocacy. And so I'm hoping, and I believe, and I've obviously been looking back at episodes for this, and just, I guess I try to sometimes, maybe not as much as I should, one of the early, when we talked about doing this, and Natasha was certainly part of that conversation, we wanted this to be oriented toward some public idea of education, to be instructional, but then also, I guess the other side of that coin is by putting a lot of these resources out there, it is a resource in and of itself, right? A sort of digital library of sorts of resources. Nothing major here, but it is a pool of resources. Of course, the Unfound brand itself, the overall Unfound platform, as I used to call it in these episodes, is doing that anyway. So in a way, we're part of that. Kathy, ancestry and similar websites are fascinating. One of my adopted brother's kids found my brother's biological family earlier this year using Ancestry. It's a great resource, by the way, folks. Just a reminder. I wanted to use tonight also to remind of some important resources. If you are at a library, whether that be if you somehow have access to a university library or just your local library, check and see if they have an Ancestry library subscription, which could allow you to use Ancestry on site. There's typically, my understanding, not remote access permitted, even if you have a special library or university connection. But just because of the nature of that subscription. Of course, Ancestry in general is a paid service, whether you choose to do that or not. But yeah, it could be a great resource. I guess nowadays it's the big. It's not the only big. We've talked some of that in the genealogy episode, but it certainly can be helpful, and you can certainly supplement it with some other resources. When I talk about some things, I'm going to start with some things that and again, please feel free at any point to ask questions or to chime in. So just to transition, something I maybe want to do better, not just in the episodes, but also in my own promoting of Unfound episodes, even the playlist, is just sort of packaging this as a resource. Granted, some episodes have gone better than others, and that's, again, more me. I do this every day, talking, right? Not talking on a camera and not talking on a camera that ends up on YouTube about, cold case sort of things, but talking. But, I certainly don't have the media experience that someone like an Ed has. So certainly we've had to have some conversations along the way about what has gone well and what has gone better, and what needed to get better and what still needs to get better. And that's okay. You need to do that for any sort of endeavor. But were some areas that I think that have not been cultivated well by me. And I want to be committed going forward to do a better job on this. Not that I've never done it, and Ed has certainly encouraged me to continue to do it, and that is to figure out ways to integrate some of these discussions with reference to the vast array of unfound episodes we have. And I'm talking about the podcast. Now, the idea of that, of course, is not only about, hey, it continues to loop back and promote the podcast. It's because they are a good resource. And a lot of the people that either participate or at least some portion that will watch this have those as points of reference. That's even as we shifted towards this case study mode, because some of those typically historical cases that I cover, can be compared to, unfound cases, regardless of where they happened at time. Now, there are times where I've done that. And there are times, even in those earlier themed episodes, where I did that better than others. But I didn't do that enough, and I haven't done that enough. And I think that's something, is it a preparation issue? Probably. Is it a needing to spend more time looking for those connections? Not force them, but look for them, probably. And I think just in a general note, it's just looking for that. Because, you all know, it's the same that I do, that learning from comparison, is helpful. And so that's something I need to do a better job. Another area, and again with Natasha here, I credited her for really being a big part of the early days of this and forward. especially from a content standpoint, when we started to get into discussions about culture and geography, because we had some pretty intensive discussions early on, episode 1 through 5 in terms of deep research, but then we started to get into other things, right? Up through 9. It was one of the ones I featured tonight, why people go missing. And so we got a little more into culture and geography, and of course, with some of the background that Natasha brings to the table, including academically, we had some really helpful theoretical and practical discussions about thinking about culture. And of course, we have kept cultural issues on the table. I don't want to make it look like we've totally devoided that, but there have probably been some missed opportunities to think about ways that sort of these tangible and intangible aspects of culture can play a role in giving perspective to the fact analysis dynamic of these cases, and thinking through what might be some other important questions to consider. And by the way, to Natasha's earlier question, although I'm certainly not an anthropologist or a sociologist or a philosopher of culture or anything like that, coming from a rhetoric and communication background, certainly there's a lot of ways, of course, where communication and culture overlap. And so that said, that's would be sort of on my list of considerations. But I do think that that's probably something that I need to continue to think more through. Now, again, there's times with certain cases that we've discussed where culture certainly has been a lot of the mix. I've also think on the mapping geography side, there's probably some times, yes, there's with some of these cases we've talked about some specific aspects of place and some interesting things about it, but probably need to do more with that. I did mention that episode number 9, why people go missing. I think that was definitely one of our highlights, and I'm going to remind about it again. I think that was a good theoretical and practical discussion that a lot of people had some good ideas about. Obviously, as some folks remember, at some point we made a decision to shift from Zoom to basically using what Ed and a lot of people use for these sorts of things, and that's YouTube Live. There are pros and cons to both approaches. No need to get into all those. I think in the main, though, this has probably benefited us more than sticking with Zoom. But there are certainly some advantages to it. Kathy, number 9 was a good one. I spent a few hours preparing for that. We had some really substantial discussion that evening, that episode. Working premise, of course, was that, whether it be, for cases in particular, as a general matter, it's important to understand sort of the range of reasons why people go missing objectively and subjectively. Of course, then when you're looking at a case, a missing persons case, you sort of have that checklist. Now, the circumstances, the context of the case may lend itself to more questions than others. One certainly should not try to force something on a case. But on the other side of that coin, one needs to be open to possibilities, especially as they're learning new information, which does happen at times. Sometimes through strong research, sometimes it just happens. And so that was a substantive episode in terms of content for sure. One thing I mentioned early on, and I need to have a chat with Ed about this because obviously he has to sign off on whatever ideas I have. It's his brand with our participation. Natasha, I've heard Ed say that it can take 10 minutes or less for someone to go missing. I'm gonna sit the fence for this one. I'll say I probably agree. But in some cases, there's lead up to it. Let me use the example, the very unfortunate example of suicide. Unfortunately, someone in a very short time could do something that can end their life, right? And sometimes that entails going missing. Of course, many times it doesn't. That said, there's a lead up to that. So do you say that the actual specific actions pertaining to the suicide that caused them to go missing, they jump off a bridge, God forbid, or something, or, do you say, well, there's a lead up to that in terms of the implications of that? That obviously this could be a longer discussion. And Natasha, what do you think? Or Kathy, what do you think? You can agree or disagree with that. Depends on the person's lifestyle and risk factors. I'm recounting Kathy here. Very low risk. That's true. Risk assessment, risk factor, risk management, whatever term one wants to use these days. That's a very good question, though. So really, mindsets, why people go missing, the context of missing. But yeah, I think there are times, apart from some of this nuance that we're trying to bring to it, which we should, and Ed would encourage, yeah, it could happen quick. Right? It could be a real sinister a sinister person is going through a neighborhood and snatches a child. Right? The parents could be taking the most preparation possible. And that child is just either enticed or overpowered by this sinister person. And that takes less than 10 minutes. Now, there's lead up to that by the sinister person and the planning. Of course, that needs to be understood, and maybe that's part of the mix. But yeah, in terms of the practicality of it, yeah, it can take 10 minutes or less. Abduction, foul play, yes. Natasha, Kathy, high risk, relationship problems, drugs, doing unsafe things, being attached to unsafe characters. Right? Obviously, people who are involved in gang, organized crime, things like that is high risk, right? For sure. So yeah, one idea, and it was sort of part of the mix early on, we envisioned this and we've continued this, that, I would lead it, Ed and I and the team would throw ideas around, and then think tank people would participate. And that's basically been our model. But the idea of special guests was on the table from the start. Now, again, any ideas I have here, Ed and I would have to talk about. Of course, in a way, I guess last time and this time, Natasha's back. She's kind of a special guest. And I'm glad she's here tonight. But that idea going forward is something to consider more. This isn't an interview program, so it wouldn't become that per se, although that could be part of someone special helping me facilitate the conversation. I've had the idea in the past, and Ed's so busy, as am I and all of us, could we do a thing where Ed was on here and sort of I integrated him and even interviewed him on some things, but that's just a maybe. So I want to revisit, that special guest notion. Again, this is not an interview program, but it is something we maybe could mix into the mix. Something I want to do more going forward, and this is also not a program where we're going to spend a lot of time with specifics, doing sort of critical analysis of current discussions in a very specific way. Of course, every once in a while, I may mention something that I'm not happy about that's going on out there on the net or whatever. But, we talk about current issues that we can at least be attentive to. There's a lot of junk and hype on the internet, particularly on YouTube, particularly when it comes to cold cases, particularly when it even comes to certain missing person cases. I can tell you, as someone who keeps up on the organized crime discussions on YouTube, particularly for one or a few cases, to gain some historical perspective and some ongoing networking and things like that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of junk and hype. There's a lot of unnecessary focus on things, and people drift from fact and then plausible analysis. And so that's a problem. That's not all the time. But, okay, now let me broaden this out here. Maybe some better discussion going forward about ways to evaluate sort of some of the quality in those areas. For instance, and I may have mentioned this example before, you watch programs, whether it's a podcast or you watch it on YouTube, or if it's something that crosses over. You'll and a lot of this just becomes drama and hype, but it becomes a sort of serious research issue too, right? So people will say, well, they're such and such said this. Well, they were an informant or they were a rat. Okay, now I get the whole mindset thing and organized crime about that. But the reality is, from a law enforcement point of view, a journalistic point of view, and a public information point of view generally, right? The bottom line is in a lot of cases, not just organized crime cases, by the way, right? There's been forward movement for the public because people have cooperated with the government, okay, on very serious things, okay? And so that, dismissal of that role, right, is a problem, okay? Now, on the other side of that coin, it does make sense, right? There's a sort of modest premise at work there that it does make sense to be cautious of what someone who was an informant is saying publicly, especially outside of the context of where they had to tell the truth legally, right? To keep their agreements going, whatever. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't necessarily know how all those arrangements work in terms of what not just they say inside a legal context to the government or to on trial, but also in a public way outside of that. So, but the point is, we don't accept everything those say uncritically, but, the hype and the drama that goes with the sort of battles on YouTube that distract people from getting at the truth or missed opportunities to think through the truth is a problem. Now, I'm just giving one example. So I don't know, maybe we need to spend more time with the evaluation of resources. There's a lot of junk and hype out there. The other thing is, and this goes back to our early episodes, we do a good job of it. I need to do more of it individually, but we all collectively try to do a good job. This spinoff program, I think, helps with it. With all the media saturation that goes on, digital and otherwise, we're really committed to bringing attention and awareness to just individual missing persons cases and the notion of missing persons cases in general. That's getting people's attention. There's a lot of competition for people's attention, and it's a tough thing to break through. In expanding that awareness of missing persons cases, right? I think raising awareness, raising attention of these things is a challenge. And that's something that's still a current issue that still needs to be on our mind, and so forth. Where we've continued to do well for the most part, again, with maybe some little areas that I can facilitate better. And this goes back to something that Ed and I discussed when I was a guest on his program for the Donna Michalenko case. There's a lot of sincere people out there who share things. There are times where in cases, various cases, missing persons cases, other cases, cold cases of different types, where there's just something inaccurate that gets printed years ago. Well-meaning. Could be sloppy journalism, not even necessarily intentional disinformation, anything like that. And especially in a digital age, as things get digitized, reprinted, discussed, then that just keeps getting repeated, right? People are needing to do that correctional work. And so when you're really, and we do a good job of emphasizing this, I might be able to reiterate this a little bit more, but part of a lot of times what we're up against in cases is just shifting through and shifting back, especially with the more historical cases that I tend to focus on here. sort of sorting through that. Now, granted, there are times when people legitimately could debate certain things, or certain things are unknown or speculative, but sometimes they're just inaccurate things that get reprinted and repeated. And so I think going forward, we want to continue to have that renewed focus to work through that. Your research connects the dots and is based on facts. Are you more optimistic that this approach can help solve missing persons cases when you first started on the team? Yes, I'm more optimistic on this. Kathy, there are always inaccuracies in articles about missing persons. If you study the case well, you can quickly pick out the info. Specific examples, Natasha, I'll deal with that in the future. But I should, and I will do that. I am optimistic about this approach, yes. And yes, Kathy, if you have a focused eye and are looking at a good wide range of resources, then navigating through that can be helpful. And especially in an internet age, though, sometimes correcting the record can be difficult. Okay, let's go to another highlight. And this, of course, I have a strong personal bias here. I think the episode itself is a resource. And again, I'm not saying that to be egocentric, but that's, of course, episode number 16, the genealogy episode. In those days, we were doing longer episodes. Now we're doing them in about an hour. It's one that I've tried, and I need to share more with people just as a resource. I think that was a highlight. It's something I do try to keep on the table. I thought we've done a pretty good job of, since then and before then, focusing on, and when we're going through these cases, not, genealogy, of course, just the family history research notion, but even other sorts of sources that, even if it's not genealogical, they're relevant. And they go to genealogy, they go to public records materials, they go to even certain scholarly primary source materials. I've tried to focus, I think, relatively well on credible governmental resources. I speak a lot on USA.gov in its search functionality, and various governmental level databases. I know Kathy, and at times, has reiterated, certain things that are out there, and as have some others. So I think that episode is a good episode. And again, this is not meant to be egocentric. I think that's a resource episode that I would encourage anyone to take the time to listen through. And even if you participated in it, listen through it again. I know just that sort of reflection, can remind any of us of something that's out there. Another highlight, and this went into our era of the case study approach, again, that was prompted by Ed, and that's the Marvin Clark episode. And again, I'm just going to, read from the summary that we worked on, Ed and I. All the references are in the episode, so that's already out there, right? Marvin A. Clark disappeared in 1926. Clark was living at the time in Tigard, Oregon. He was born at some point in the 1850s. Marvin and his wife Mary had 4 children. Clark began traveling to visit his daughter in Portland, Oregon on October 30th, 1926. He went missing along the way. In 1986, skeletal remains, along with some items from the early 20th century, were found in Multnomah County, Oregon. With the available evidence, law enforcement ruled this death as a suicide. Later, DNA testing excluded these skeletal remains as those of Marvin Clark. So it's still an open case. What was great about that case was, as a case study, right, because you were dealing with the historical side as well as some of the later findings, and it got into the DNA, and there was some material about it. That case enabled us to get into a lot of the different facets of the things that we like to talk about in terms of the research. But on the other hand, and I don't want to say that this is like I'm groundbreaking for bringing this case forward, but it is interesting to me that with the age of the case and the fact that there's been that there was, and it really technically is, ongoing interest in the case, that the case does not have greater visibility. I'm not saying it's not discussed out there. Certainly we had some resources on there where it had been, and we gave due credit to it. But in 2023, this is at least I technically didn't check for this episode. I haven't heard anything groundbreaking about it, and I'm assuming that it's not been solved since we covered it. But the reality is that case should have more visibility. Now, I tried to do a little bit of networking. One of the things another area that I want to do better, or let's say more consistently. I try to do some networking before and after, more after, I guess, these come out, to let certain people know we've covered it, that, hey, I've relied upon your materials. Obviously, that helps the program, that helps this, that helps Ed, that helps Unfound. And you never know what sort of networking comes out of that for future study. Now, I tend to say with these cases, like, I'm not necessarily an expert. I try to learn it more, to be, knowledgeable about it, to discuss it. We're using it as a case study, right? What are the important primary sources? What are the relevant, credible secondary sources? Who's covering it well? What are the open questions? But I can see, not now necessarily, but maybe in the near to mid future, digging a little bit more deeply, becoming a little bit more connected to that Marvin Clark case. I'd like to see it get more visibility. I would encourage you to share that particular link with as many people as possible. It's just an interesting thing to me. So let's do our part. I haven't dove back into it with deeper research since, but that's something I could. It was a really good case for what we're trying to learn about. And I think it's the kind of case that, doesn't have the visibility, certainly, of a Hoffa or D.B. Cooper, and it probably couldn't because of the sort of the prominent circumstances of those cases. But in terms of as other cases go, that case should be more visible. And I need to do my part to help with that, and I encourage others to do the same. We've covered in the, some of the other case studies, some of the, again, I thought that the Jimmy Hoffa case was the first one we did when we did the shift. I thought that one went fairly well. I thought all of them have gone okay, some better than others. And certainly, again, I get some good feedback from Ed. Looking back at resources, and again, thanks to Natasha for her help in these days. Of course, I mentioned the unfoundpodcast.com. We do have some web space, unmaintained well by me, no one's fault. Of course, frankly, Ed's website's an important place. It is what I always say, sort of the central hub of all things Unfound. But I think in the future, it's legitimate if we put off a little bit some of the updating of the Unfound on the ground part of the website. But again, that data gems page, although not well maintained at all by me or through me to Ed. I really don't have background access to the site, but I'm the one that should be sending stuff to put there. Still a great resource. White noise. Natasha, thank you. I like how you go from more obscure cases to the well-known, like Roanoke. Yeah, and again, I have to give props, as they say nowadays, also to Ed on that for some back and forth idea generation, other team members. Okay, so ideas come from different places that we run with. One resource that we may have mentioned in terms of the Wayback Machine, and looking back, I can't tell for sure if I've emphasized this enough. Has anyone ever used archive.org? ARCHIVE.org. Of course, that's the home of the Wayback Machine, which we know is a way to look at a website that maybe look at a website that might be defunct in terms of some snapshots that site's taking of the internet. However, I will say, if you go to the search capacity, and of course it usually makes sense to pick the option of search text contents. It's usually a great way. Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. The Roanoke episode was fascinating. That's a great topic for sure, historically, and as always with all of our missing persons discussions. Archive.org, that's one I think, and I'll try to mention that more often. Now, again, like with any source, it's not necessarily going to have everything for everybody, but because it has a lot, it can be a good source, whether you're looking about an area, about a person, about old publications, certain things that be pertaining to genealogy, right? To keep that archive.org on our list. And I'll try to mention that one more often, right? There's certain ones I mention all the time, or most of the time. But that one, I think maybe over the episodes, I haven't mentioned much at all or enough. Again, at some point, we might have mentioned the Wayback Machine, which, of course, is tied to that site. But good thing to keep in the mix. Another thing so that's good enough for that. Also, looking back at some of the old discussions we had about resources, and we've talked about shareable material. And so one of the ones I mentioned earlier on, which again is important because, again, if you click on each, and I mentioned this early on, maybe in episode 1 or 2 or 3, I can't remember right now. If you click on one of the caches, you have a poster. You can just share that page. There's some preset internet sharing, right? The kidnapping and missing persons on the FBI, right? If you're looking to just get started or expand what you're doing in terms of raising awareness of missing persons cases, that's a great place to go. Obviously, it's the FBI. I think one can work with the reasonable assumption that it's fairly well maintained. That's not to say that it's 100% up to date all the time, but you would assume with the Federal Bureau of Investigation that would be fairly well kept up to date. So something to remind there, sort of blast from the past. As we get into our final 15 minutes here, if there's anyone has any other suggestions or if you want to mention any highlights or ways that things that have gone well, but also it's okay here to say, hey, I'd like to see us do this better, us/I, your host. I take full responsibility for the gaps, but happen to give full credit to others for the achievements. Please chime in on that. Don't be afraid to do that. One other one I want to mention, and remember, this is something I'm a big fan of as a resource. Remember the Society of Professional Journalists. They have the toolbox with all sorts of web resources. I do mention this once in a while, of course. But again, if you're recalibrating, rebookmarking, getting caught up to date on your resource list, please keep that in the mix because there's a lot of stuff in there that's good for both research and communication and publicity and tips. And I do know that they update that. Maybe create email address for members to suggest future topic episodes. That's not a bad idea. I mean, they can always share something with me directly or with Ed, and he could pass it on to me. But maybe I should do that. Yeah, I enjoyed talking about the elements of a disappearance: location, resources, community groups. Yeah, that was certainly helpful. One thing I want to do, and we do it kind of when we do this case study approach. I mean, I obviously try to find the people who are most knowledgeable about the case, and with those historical cases, it's the scope of the conversation's a little different. But yeah, that is important. Even for the historical cases, like when we talked about, in the last case, just some of the people even in the local community that are keeping the memory alive and the influence alive. So all that gets really important, for sure. Yeah, that's not a bad idea, Natasha. I'm going to talk about that one with Ed, just to see if he has a preference on that. But I'm more than happy to use one of my various email addresses, or maybe Ed would have a preference. But yeah, I think that's a good idea too. Have an email address specifically for topic suggestions. And we're using this case study approach now. And there are certainly a lot of ideas that are still out there regarding that. So that's a good one for sure. Okay, so the FBI wanted to re-mention that from the past. And then last but not least, certainly one of our favorites that gets mentioned a lot in the Unfound. And I'm doing this also, folks, keep in mind, for some people who may watch this video in the future when it's publicized, so that they can get a sort of taste of what this program's about. Maybe if they see this for the first time when it gets distributed here in the future. And that, of course, is Charlie Project. It's another great resource, and that's, of course, that's CHARLEY project.org. Of course, the great Megan Good, who's doing that work. And so that's a great resource. Again, it's a resource in and of itself. She, links at the on there some source information if you wanted to do further research. She gives some of the important overviews of the case. It also becomes shareable material if you're looking to publicize certain cases. It's a good one. So, again, many of us in this quote unquote, I guess, this community are familiar, very familiar, but sometimes by way of reminder. Remember, if we go all the way back, certainly she was one of the original list of sources that we were recommending. Have you noticed any new trends in your new resources? On the media side, crowdsourcing is front and center in major TV series like Murder. And yeah, so early on, I was in these episodes trumpeting crowdsourcing. And I'd say, well, that's something we could link to the notion of crowdsourcing in a certain way, right? There's some crowdsourcing built into a lot of these bigger programs where people collaborate. But when you get into a sort of a pronounced crowdsourcing effort that's going to have sort of established channels of communication, specific research aims that could involve mapping, right, with some of the platforms that are out there, that could go to sort of locational information, other sorts of qualitative and quantitative information. There are some resource and platform issues that need to be in place to do that well. I personally, I know that is consistently happening. I've not kept up enough on the platforms that are available to do that. But I think that it is, my general view of crowdsourcing is that for this sort of endeavor, it can be helpful. Probably if, and again, I'm not the expert here, I'm just thinking through some things I've read and persons whom I've spoke to about this over the years, right? But you have to have an understanding of scope, and you have to understanding of purpose and aim, and who's participating. Because there's also that reality, and again, this isn't necessarily an original thought of mine, just through some reading and conversations, understanding that issue of scope, right? What are you maximizing in terms of, okay, where is it now? You have the number of people whom you need to talk to get the help you need. Now, I would argue there's probably the other side of that coin, is that for something like missing persons cases, widening that net is probably better than not. Because if you're doing the work to sift through that properly, because when you're doing crowdsourcing, you're trying to work through and expand the effort on discovering things that are factual, but also in some sense interpretive or perspectival, right? That sometimes if you have multiple eyes, even looking on the same material, that you might be getting some nuance or insights. It's just like when you look at something 40 years later versus then, could there be something with the passage of time and with other resources are available that bring new light to that topic? That's a very wordy way of answering that in a very elementary way. Hopefully, Natasha, that answered your question. But it is something I thought about for this and looking at some of our early material, right? Some of you may remember. I talked about crowdsourcing. And I'd like to encourage more of that. In a way, there's a sort of aspects of that go on. But when you're talking about something more formal and wide scale, that's a different sort of thing. But that's a good reminder to bring the crowdsourcing concept back into the mix. We have about 6 minutes, folks. Again, if you have anything else you want to mention. So again, charlieproject.org. Keep it out there, even if you just share the site itself, even if you don't share a specific case. It's a great resource for sure. So again, a couple other highlights. I'm really glad we did number 13, missing persons in Native American communities. It was a really good collaborative effort. That's certainly an area. You talk about culture, you talk about, just some of the challenges and so forth. That was really important. I'm glad we did that. Really important. Episode 11, historical overview of missing person cases. That was a great episode because, we ended up covering a range of cases that when Ed was encouraging this shift to a case study approach, there were some things that were already on the table that I was able to run with. That episode 11 was a good episode in terms of that historical overview of missing persons cases. White noise level 3, have you noticed any nuances from doing on the ground brought about by discussion that seemed interesting to you? Absolutely. So for instance, let's go to, let me pick one here. Let me use an example here. Some of this comes down to my conversations with Ed too. I look at episode 28, the McDermott case, for sure. I guess that's a good one that comes to mind. And that's one where I probably could have done a better job on for sure. Getting to know the discussion helped with that, but then some follow-up I did with Ed helped with that too. There was probably some more I could have either delved into or featured as asking questions about Mr. McDermott and some of the people around him in terms of more about their life interest and his life interests going back to before, even when he was romantically involved with Olivia Newton-John and the disappearance and so forth. So I guess this is a really quick question. I know nuances that need to be prioritized about learning about the totality of that person's life leading up to the point of when they disappear. That's important. I will say that let me go back to this question because this is a really good question. I really liked, for me, a learning episode was 15, forensic science for missing persons cases. It's I'm not a forensic scientist. My knowledge of that was certainly, I needed to read up on what I needed to feature for that. At that time, I think I don't remember if some of you may remember, I don't remember exactly when I made the step to even finally doing DNA for genealogy. That conversation with the participants and just doing it was very insightful for me, and seeing how some of that fit together. I think we take some of that for granted because we see media and all that. maybe myself as someone who's in rhetoric and argumentation, I understand the connection because, right, even in a court of law, as I tell my students, right, with the notion of forensic rhetoric, you still have to persuade a judge or jury. So that's the idea, is getting that evidence. That was insightful for me. Number 10, public perceptions, was helpful for nuance. That was one I remember having some good follow-up conversation with Ed too, and the conversation in the episode was very good. That was one where there were probably some things I certainly picked up from the conversation. I realized some missed opportunities in that after the fact, which for me, I'm not a media scholar per se, but I, at a basic level, teach media, and as a communication person generally should be attuned to media. And so, that was one where I definitely took some of that away. I hope I'm answering your question, Natasha. Kathy, sometimes there's very little info about a missing person. Sometimes the actual date of the person went missing is unknown. Yeah, sometimes we don't know for sure, right? We don't know for sure when Ambrose Bierce went missing, right? We don't know for sure when Solomon Northup went missing, right? Back to the last episode. And that, of course, occurs today, too. I'm just keeping our historical notion in mind. Some families don't keep in touch with one another. That's true. So those nuances have been helpful. Natasha, you've asked some wonderful questions that I'm going to keep thinking about. I should have said to folks, come prepared with questions. Kathy, again, you get our official, unofficial award, Unfound on the Ground number 30, Look Forward, Look Back award. Folks, we run out of time. I'm glad we did this episode. We're going to keep it moving. There's no plans to cancel this spinoff program, so we'll get a season 2, so to speak. I guess by now, technically, it might be season 3 or 4, whatever we would be on. But as I always say, someone out there knows something or knows someone who knows something. So keep that in mind. Again, if you like this on YouTube. And if you watch this in the future, when we end up publicizing this episode, certainly share the link and subscribe to Unfound if you haven't. That's for the future. Don't forget the unfoundpodcast.com, the unfoundpodcast.com. And again, Kathy, Natasha, thank you. And thanks to all folks from the team and the think tank who've been part of this for now 30 episodes. Folks, have a great week. Have a great rest of the year. Have a blessed Christmas and a beautiful new year. Be well, folks. I'm now stopping the stream.